or nod. Great. Awesome. All right, so tonight we are talking about sensory or behavior, understanding your child's sensory needs and how they impact their behavior. Nope. There we go. So why is this important? This is an important topic because if our children are not regulated, if they're having sensory needs that are not being met, then they are not able to thrive. They're not able to learn and take in new information. And so this topic is one that I have talked about before. And I love hearing from parents after that they understand their kids in a new way because of this. So there we go. Let's see. So we talk about behavior and what are some of the negative behaviors you might see in your kids, especially young kids. I'm still getting the hang of this PowerPoint. We might see things like aggression, hitting, not listening, running away, tantruming, and strong emotions. And all of these behaviors can feel very triggering as a parent or as a professional. But what I want to look at today is kind of the root cause of a lot of these behaviors. Is our child acting out and misbehaving on purpose, or is there something going on in their brain and their body that we can help them with? And hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll have some tools that you can use to kind of help reduce these types of behavior. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. So the first thing to know about sensory processing is that we all take in information through our senses. Everything we learn about the world is through our senses. And these 5 are what we might commonly think of when we think of sensory. We think of what we can hear in our world, what we can taste, our vision, smells, things we can touch, and our sense of pain. So these are the common ones that we might think of that could impact our interpretation of the world, right? And we're all different. We might prefer loud music, we might prefer soft music, or spicy food or mild food. Like our bodies and our sensory systems were developed to be unique. And so I have 2 children and their sensory systems are pretty much opposite, just to make it exciting for me as a parent. But these are some of our senses, but there's 3 more that we don't often talk about unless you're like me and are an OT. And these can really impact our kids. So I want to show you the other 3. We also have these 3 systems called vestibular, proprioception, and interoception. These are big fancy words, but they describe something going on in our body. So our vestibular system is in our inner ear, and it's our sense of movement. Best example I can give you as an adult is if you've been on a roller coaster recently and you've experienced that maybe it feels different than when you were a child, because as we age, our vestibular system gets a little more sensitive. So a roller coaster might feel really bad on our body when it used to be really fun. For kids who like a lot of vestibular input, you might see them crave and seek out movement. They might be spinning, they might be tumbling a lot. These are your rough and tumble kids because they're seeking more of that input. On the other end of that, if they don't have good vestibular processing, they might look clumsy because they don't have a good sense of their of changes of movement or balance. So that's that. Please leave a message in the chat if you get lost here, because this is the most technical we'll get and the rest will be pretty easy to understand. Proprioception is our sense of where we are in space. And I have a person doing yoga in the illustration here because that can increase our body awareness and our sense of where we are in space. A lot of kids that I have seen have poor proprioception. They don't know where they are in space. And so they're looking for information through other senses. So if you've ever had a kid that is like constantly leaning on you or like touching you, or when you sit down on the floor, they're falling over, they might not have a very good body map for where they are in space. So they need more input to feel grounded and to feel, oh, this is my boundary. Got it. Interoception is just a fancy way of saying how we interpret our internal signals. So how we feel hunger, how we feel pain. It's, our sense of knowing when we have to go to the bathroom. And you could have kids on opposite ends of the spectrum here, where you have kids that maybe feel every little sensation very strongly. So, oh, I'm so hungry, I'm starving, even though they just ate, or they have to pee every hour because they are so tuned into their interoception. They feel every little twinge, right? And then there are the kids that maybe struggle with potty training and they just cannot get that body signal of when their bladder is full and they're having accidents. So all of these things, if we go back, our sense of sight, our hearing, all of this, and our body awareness is giving us this information about the world. And it's helping our body and our brain feel calm if we're getting enough information, if we're getting correct information. So we are all different, even our children and ourselves included, and we all have different preferences and needs. So I like these images because it is the same environment, right? Both these kids are at the beach and they're having a totally different reaction. So there's this sensory seeker, I'm calling him, on the top, and he is buried in the sand and he's smiling big and he's wanting more and more and more of that touch sensation of the sand. And then on the bottom, there's my sensory avoider, and he's got his legs pulled up and he's wearing his socks. He's still at the beach, but he does not want to touch the sand. So it's just important to be aware that we can be in the same environment, we can be in the same routines, and our sensory systems are influencing how we're interacting with those environments. Sorry, I just opened the chat and we're really big. There we go. So I like to do a demonstration because I'm a visual learner, and I like to show you guys just exactly what I mean with sensory avoiding, sensory seeking, sensory craving. So let's see, I'm going to tilt my screen a little bit. I want you to consider that everyone is born, and this is something you're born with different sensory systems. Some people are born with this big cup, right? And some might be born with a small cup. Now, all throughout our day, we are exposed to different sensory input. So let's imagine that we wake up and we smell breakfast. That's something that we're taking in. And then we put on our clothes and there's a really itchy tag, and that's something that's impacting us. This person has a big cup, so they're going to need more input before their sensory needs are met. Another person, let's keep going. So we're going throughout the day and they go to the playground and someone bumps into them, and that's sensory input, right? And then they go on the swings, they get that sensory input. And then there's some really loud music and they just don't like it. And that's the point where they overflow. But it took a lot of input for that person to get their sensory needs met or overflow. Whereas someone else with a small bucket might wake up and have an itchy tag and their bucket is already half full. And they might get bumped on the playground, and then that is enough to send them into this overflow. And this sensory overflow is where we see the behavior that we were looking at before. We are, as clinicians and as parents, trying to avoid the overflow. So our job throughout the day, and our job to teach parents, is to find ways to empty our bucket. We want our kids to learn how to empty their own bucket. So we'll talk about some strategies today of how to do that. But I love this image of we are born with different size sensory buckets. And that is going to impact how we see the world and how we how long our fuse is, right? So if you have a small cup, you might become sensory avoiding because everything can feel triggering and kind of can push you into that overload. Whereas if you have a big cup, think back to the kid in the sand, you need more input to feel it, to feel satisfied, to feel like your needs are met. And this can go with any of those sensory systems, right? You might have a sensory seeker who needs a lot of movement, and he has a big sensory cup. He needs so much movement to get that need met. Or you have a child who can't even go down the slide because their sense of movement is so responsive that it's triggering to them. There's a third category, which we call sensory cravers. And this can be very tricky as a parent and as a clinician because they seem like they have a big bucket and they seem like they want a lot of input. They're constantly moving or seeking maybe food, snacking, and seeking that sensation. But watch what happens when they get the input. Their bucket, I don't know if you can see it, it's leaking. So if you're giving them constant input and the bucket is leaking, they're never getting to a place where they can feel satisfied. So sensory cravers are tricky because you need the right kind of input in order to seal those holes so that their bucket stays full. We want to connect their mind and their body together. So I gave the example of a child who likes to spin. If a child was sensory seeking, where's my sensory seeking? Then a lot of spinning would eventually feel good. If they were sensory craving, a lot of spinning would keep dripping out. It wouldn't feel like enough, and it might actually get them more overwhelmed. But if you connect their mind and body together, like we're going to pretend to be a tornado and we're going to spin 5 times one way and then stop, 5 times the other way and then stop. Then their brain and their body is connecting and they feel the sensation. So they don't need more. They can kind of stop in that place. So, does that make sense? I'm just going to check, do I have any questions? All right, and the other thing I want to mention is that some kids start their day where their bucket is already full of something. Some kids are going through trauma or are going through a chronic health condition or have stress, and their bucket is starting full. This could be a minor stressful event in your child's life, but if they're starting the day with something in their bucket, when you add input that's difficult for them, watch what happens. So maybe they couldn't tie their shoe, they got frustrated, and then they got scared that morning or something happened. The input becomes more explosive and they get to that sensory overload much faster. I often have parents tell me, my child was able to put their pajamas on every day this week, and then one day it was a meltdown. Like, what happened? It was that overflow, that sensory meltdown. Well, what happened that day? And they stop and think, we had a doctor's appointment that day, and then they fell and got hurt. And I think, yeah, their bucket was already full of stress. So all of this was layering and triggering this big reaction. So when we think of it this way, we can be proactive throughout the day and have strategies so that when there's the behavior, we're not so upset and angry and wondering, why did this little thing cause this big behavior? We're able to see the whole picture and have some sensory and behavioral strategies to help. Now, I have my own children, right? I have boys that are active. There is a difference between tantrums and sensory overload. And tantrums are natural and they happen, and everything I say today will not make them go away forever. I'm sorry. But I want you to know that the difference is usually in a tantrum. If you give them what they want, it'll stop the tantrum, right? They're crying and whining. They want an extra hour of TV. Okay, you say yes, the tantrum stops. I'm not saying to do that, but that's the example. But if they were having sensory overload, they are literally in a place in their brain where they can't respond. So if the TV was the trigger and now they're in sensory overload, and you say, fine, watch an hour of TV, it's not going to calm them down because they have gotten to a place where their brain is protecting itself and it has shut down the thinking zone. So that's kind of the difference. Tantrums can be solved. Sensory overload is a neurological state. Lots of tantrums can definitely lead to overload, right? If you think of a tantrum, they're loud and there's a lot going on in the environment and they can kind of trigger that. Also in general, a sensory overload might last a lot longer than a tantrum. So what do we see with sensory overload? What is happening when our buckets are overflowing? And this is something that we don't really have control over until we learn how to better react. But sorry. So basically what's happening is our brain is going into fight, flight, or freeze mode in order to protect itself from a perceived threat. So this is something our brains do naturally to protect ourselves from real threat. And what can be confusing is that kids that are sensitive to sensory input will go into these states over things that are not actually threatening, right? Like maybe their food looked different today. And instead of that being a minor problem, their brain is coding that as, this is a big deal, I don't feel safe. So these protective responses cause behavior. And look what they look like. They look just like the behavior we saw a few minutes ago. The fight is the aggression, right? The hitting, the trying to protect itself. The flight is shutting down, not listening, or running away, or hiding. The freeze is the freeze is tantruming, or it can also be an anxious smile where you look and the kids look like they're doing okay and they've got this smile on their face, but they're also frozen, and it's them trying to have some time to process their sensory overload. So if we reframe these negative behaviors as results of sensory overload, their brain is trying to protect themselves. What does that mean for our parenting and for our clients? That means that we want to change it, right? We want to change the cycle. We want to make it so that we don't get to that place where our child's brain jumps in and says, we have to do fight, flight, or freeze. So how do we have regulated kids? And just so you know, I use the term regulated a lot as a therapist. I don't think as a mom I would have used that term. But when I say regulated, I mean, I want our kids to be calm and happy and ready to learn. And that's a state in their body that they have to be in. So first of all, we regulate, we calm before we respond. So if you think about like the overflow that's happening with our sensory overload, that is not the time to teach a new behavior. Even though as a parent, if we're in public and our child is having a giant meltdown, we want to correct it and to teach them because we don't want to be embarrassed and we don't want it to happen. We have to remember that our child is not in a place where their brain can take in new information. They literally can't. There's this hand model of the brain that I find helpful where, sorry. Oh, I lost something. There we go. This finger is our amygdala, and that is the part of our brain responsible for our big emotions and our fight, flight, freeze response. And this is our prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain. does all the thinking and analyzing. And when we're triggered, when we go into fight or flight, we flip the lid, and this part of the brain is not working until we regulate. So if our child's having a meltdown and we're trying to talk to them and reason with them, it's not successful because they're not regulated. We have to get that brain back online. So some ways to do that is just to keep the child and others safe until the meltdown is over. That might be physically holding them. That might be you going into the other room for a minute and taking a breath, because what happens is that we can help them co-regulate through our affect, our facial expressions, our tone of voice, our body language. And if we're not actually calm, if we're not regulated, then this doesn't work. So what we do is we want to model what we want to see. We might start taking some deep breaths. We might lower our body so that we're eye to eye with them. We might slow down our pace of talking, or we might stop talking altogether because, right, their brain is offline. Talking is not necessarily helping. And then we can also, in that moment, in that sensory overload moment, we can change the environment to meet their needs. So that might be as simple as turning the lights off, thinking about what background noises are on. You know, is the dishwasher running and the washing machine's on and the house is really loud? Like, can we pause something to change the environment? Do we need to go sit in the car until they're calm? So eventually, our children's bodies will calm down and they will become regulated again. And we don't want to just leave it there, right? Our child maybe has hit someone or run away or done something unsafe. And once they're calm, that's the time where we want to revisit it and go over it together. And we want to problem solve with the child. I wonder why that emotion felt so big. I wonder what the trigger was. And then we can be kind of mentally asking ourselves, did our child need more input or less input today? Like, what sensory layers were going on here that caused this? And the more, you're not going to have the answer every time. You just won't. We're humans, right? We don't know. But the more that you start asking these questions, the better you'll get at being a detective and realizing, oh, okay, they were doing homework and had a meltdown, but their brother bumped into them and they're very sensitive about their personal space. So maybe that was part of it. And oh, the TV was on in the background and they're very sensitive to sound. So maybe that was part of it. And the more you can kind of realize the triggers, the more you can help change those. Because we want our kids to be regulated as much as possible in the early years so that they can learn and grow, right? Eventually, they'll have to learn themselves how to regulate and how to manage their triggers. And that's okay, and they will. But the first step is us as parents modeling and co-regulating with them. Oh, I wanted to mention too, one thing I like to do, even with very young children, is after the meltdown, to pull out a little whiteboard, like a dry erase board, and I'll just very quietly start drawing a picture of where we were or what happened before the meltdown, and start saying, I wonder what you were thinking here. And even very young children will try to draw or communicate their experience in that moment. And that can be a really helpful way of processing and problem solving together. Okay, if that happened again, what could we do? Could we turn off the TV? What could we say to our brother when he bumped into us? So those kinds of problem solving will help so that this doesn't happen over and over and over again. Okay, so we're looking at what tools we have to keep our kids regulated. And these are tools that have been studied with research. So these are not things that I'm just making up and trying. But what research tells us is that we have the ability to change our physiology to help calm our brain and body down. And this can be done with deep breathing, heavy work, deep pressure, connection, and meeting your child's sensory needs. And we're going to go into all of these individually too. So, what is heavy work? If you're an OT, you definitely know what heavy work is. But as a parent, maybe this doesn't seem relevant. But heavy work is any activity that pushes or pulls against the joints of our bodies. So we talked about proprioception a little bit ago, and that is telling our body where it is in space. There's actually fibers in all of our joints that trigger our sense of space, our proprioception. So if you're pushing or pulling against your body, it's triggering that, and it has a calming effect on your body. You feel grounded, you know where you are in space. I think as an adult, you can think when you do some heavy exercise, maybe you lift at the gym, maybe you go running, what does that feel like afterwards? Does your body feel calmer? Does it feel grounded and refreshed? So we want to do that with our children, and we do that through play, through things like wall push-ups. I'll pretend that the wall is falling down and we have to be super strong and push against the wall to keep it up. And that's giving them that heavy pressure in their joints. You can do jumping jacks. Swimming is great. It can be very calming. Bike riding, doing the monkey bars as you're hanging, you're pulling on those joints. Tug of war, vacuuming, if they're old enough to help. That's definitely heavy work. It's hard to push and you're going back and forth. Climbing, maybe at the park, or climbing over some pillows in the house. And then even just like heavy work with your hands, doing Play-Doh or putty or clay work. If you're at the store and you don't have access to things, you can do hand squishes where you just push your hands together and count. Younger kids might like to pretend like they're squishing something. You can stomp your feet in place and just kind of give your body a little bit of quick input. So the idea is we're not going to have a kid do tug of war when they're about to have a meltdown, right? That's not the right timing. We wanted to start to incorporate these things throughout their day, throughout their week, so that they're getting constant little emptying of their bucket. So they don't reach that overflow, right? And we're going to think about the size of their bucket. Do I have a child that needs a lot of this? Maybe we join swim team, right? We're going to do it every day. Or a child that's more sensitive to this. Maybe bike riding is too hard. We're going to start with something easier, right? Carrying some heavy books around the house. So this can be challenging when you're first starting as a parent to know what to do. But I encourage you to try something and then wait and see 5 minutes later, is your child calm or is your child more upset, right? Some of these, like the jumping, also incorporate a change of head position. And that can be triggering for some kids whose inner ear, the vestibular, is sensitive. So you can work with a therapist, or you can really watch your child and know which type of activity is calming for them and good for their body in the long run. So that is heavy work. The next one that can be a great tool is called deep pressure. This can go alongside heavy work. Sometimes they go together. But this is an activity that involves deep touch or tactile pressure touch. So as an adult, we think maybe getting a massage, that feels really good and grounding to some people. For some people, that might be too much input. So joint compressions is something that I do in therapy, where you're literally just pushing two joints together. Can't do it on myself, but this, for my particular children, they love this. And we'll do this before bed or before we read books. And we we go down all the joints. We do their arms and their legs and their hips, kind of squeeze them together, and it's very calming to them. Almost immediately, their bodies just kind of melt. That's something, you know, you can learn. There's some good YouTube videos I could point you towards, but you're lightly pushing the joints together and pulling them apart in a safe way that feels very calming. There's also weighted items. I mean, Target is even selling weighted blankets right now, and weighted lap pads or weighted stuffed animals. And the idea is that the heaviness is calming to our nervous system. It also can help kids that don't know where they are in space by giving them more body awareness. I just want to say, though, don't just go buy a heavy blanket. You have to be careful that it's the right weight for your child. The recommendation is no more than 10% of their body weight, and they need to be able to remove it on their own. A really simple starting place is to make your own lap pad. Just get a couple bags of rice or beans at the store, keep them in the bag and put them in a pillowcase and just stick it on your child's lap. And I'll do this during book time or homework time and just see, like, is this a grounding input for my child, right? Is this emptying their bucket a little bit so that they can handle the next stressor? Compression clothing can be helpful, and it can be as simple as wearing those swim shirts that are lycra. They're like stretchy, getting ones that are a little bit small and hug their body. That's giving calming, hugging input all day long. Massage, giving your child a back rub or giving some squeezes or squishes can be great. Hugs is very connecting. Another favorite is the blanket burrito. You literally like have your child lay on the ground and like enclose them in a blanket like a burrito. And I will put toppings on them. So like, do you want beans on your burrito? And then squeeze the beans all the way down their body or pat the beans on. And it's very connecting and they're very grounded. And you can adjust based on what your child wants. In general, deep pressure is calming. Light touch makes you excited and a little wild. So you can see this. If you're tickling your child in the blanket burrito, they might be a little dysregulated. It might be fun, but it might be a little dysregulating. Versus if you're trying to calm them, you're using slow, deep, harder pressure. These are some pictures of some ways to get deep pressure through the day. On the left here, this little girl in the body sock, as we call it, it's a lycra fabric. And you go inside and you are getting such good feedback of where your body is in space. And you can go completely inside and you can still kind of see through it. So I'll have my kids will be like walking around the house and just cracking up because they think you can't see them, but it gives a lot of good deep pressure, and it's something that can be out in their environment that they can choose or seek after themselves, which is really nice. In the middle is a lycra swing. This might be something you put in your house or a more traditional hammock, just something that could give some deep pressure or some back and forth linear movement is also very calming. They have the compression clothing on the right. And then below that is compression bedding. So this is actually like bed sheets that are stretchy and just kind of hug you at night, which for some kids is great. Like I said, you have to know your child and their preferences, and not everybody will need this kind of compression. But for some children, it definitely helps. Okay, deep breathing. Deep breathing is the one thing that can help in the moment when they're having a meltdown. And these are some ways that I'll get buy-in for children to make it engaging and full body. So we'll do something called a volcano breath. Back up a little bit, where we are the volcano. And when we inhale, we form the volcano. And when we exhale, we make it explode by pushing your hands away to your side as you breathe out. So you inhale, exhale, and that you can help them with pacing. And when you're breathing in, you can have them push on their hands so they're getting that heavy work too, and kind of breathe out together. We're trying to flood their brain with that calming oxygen. And if you practice this when they're calm, then when they're having a hard time, they can draw on this and access it in that moment. This one is my favorite personally because it's silly enough that it can sometimes make my kids laugh even when they're having a hard time and kind of pull them out of that meltdown. But you hold up some birthday candles and you say, how many candles can you blow out? Or blow out the candles. And then they breathe out. And then you put down a candle. And I will play around with my kids like, oh no, you didn't, it came back. And they think it's so silly, or, oh no, you blew them all out. So you can do this as many times as you need to kind of get them to slow down and to just reactivate that deep breathing. And then belly breathing is something to work on, not during a meltdown, but the idea is to get your child or yourself to breathe with your diaphragm lower in your belly. The deeper breath you take, the more calming and the more oxygen you get. So kids need visuals, right? We all do. So if you put a stuffed animal or a little pillow or something on their stomach, you're going to ask them to breathe in and to try to move that stuffed animal up. So they're filling their belly with air. And then as you breathe out, you're watching the stuffed animal go down. So that belly breathing is going to get them in the habit of taking those really big, deep breaths. So these are some things that you could try to incorporate during your day. If you have a kid that is having a lot of sensory overload, or if you're finding yourself having sensory overload, remembering to ground yourself, with that full body movements, the heavy work, the deep breathing. Just imagine that you're taking a little bit out of your bucket at a time so that it's not having this big overflow reaction. Now, if we have sensory seekers who are having a hard time grounding themselves or sitting still, fidget toys can be really helpful. The more discreet, the more functional and similar to real life, the better, I think. The middle picture is chewing gum. That's something that would look socially acceptable, maybe not at school, but might get their sensory need met. The chewing can be the heavy work in their mouth, the proprioception, so they're getting calming input. The flavor is maybe alerting to them, helping them stay focused and awake. They make a lot of fun sensory toys right now. They're everywhere. Target dollar section has them, I think, every time. And so having a box or a go-to of fidget toys can be a really nice way. If you see your child starting to kind of work up to having a hard time, offer them one and see if that can help them reground and calm down. I have a box of fidgets that I'll use sometimes at the dinner table when mealtime can be very anxiety producing for kids, especially if the flavor and the smell is hard for their sensory system. So giving them a choice of a fidget can, help get their mind off of it and help calm them down a little bit. And then sensory play. You don't have to do messy play if you can't handle it, right? I want to say that because we need regulated parents and regulated kids. And if the thought of having an entire bin of rice and beans dumped on your floor is too much, you can find something that works for you. I like to think before I'm setting out my sensory bins for my kids, how much mess capacity can I handle today? And that's what I give them, right? I've given them a cup of water this big before to play in, because I'm this is what I can do today. I can clean up this much mess. But really, sensory play is so good for our kids. It helps them in a very non-threatening way, explore different textures, maybe even food that they'll eventually try eating. And so you can just get any size bin that's shallow enough for them to really get in and play with. Put lots of towels or sheets underneath to make cleanup easy. And then you can fill it with a variety of things. You can just do water in cups. Dry oatmeal is really nice for kids that might be tempted to taste things. Water beads are non-toxic, but still you would decide if you want to try that with your child. Rice and beans that are dried lentils. If you combine baking soda and conditioner, it makes this snow. I don't know how, but it feels cold. I don't know why, but it's really fun to play with. Volcanoes, which is the baking soda and vinegar, which I had in my demonstration today. Shaving cream, maybe you just do it in the shower on the wall and they get to explore and then shower off immediately. Spaghetti, all of these things can be done and give your child a way to explore safely different textures and sensations. If you have a child who's avoiding, right, they have a small bucket and sensory play might fill that bucket, you might want to think about having spoons nearby so they can use a tool instead of their hands. And I always like to have a towel nearby. And before we start, I say, this is how you clean your hands. If you need a break, this is how we wipe our hands off. And just giving them those tools to know, okay, I can try this safely. These are my boundaries. And when I'm comfortable, maybe I'll touch it with my fingers, but I can do this safely. And it's great. I mean, they learn so well through sensory play, even if it's very messy for parents. So if you are interested in learning more about sensory integration, because this is like the tip of the iceberg, guys. Like, I wish I could share so much more, but there's not time. These books have been really helpful for me, and I feel like these are the most parent-friendly books that I found. No Longer a Secret, Unique Common Sense Strategies for Children with Sensory or Motor Challenges. This one is so great for parents because you can even like thumb through to the exact chapter that you need. Like, I have a child that's sensitive to noises. Like, what do I do? And it has a list of activities. Or why does my child react this way to movement? So that one I really like. It's very easy to read. And then there's a series called The Out of Sync Child by Carol Kranowitz and Lucy Jane Miller. And there's also The Out of Sync Child Has Fun. So the first one, the one I have here, talks about sensory processing disorder. And I haven't mentioned that term today, but that would be a child whose brain cannot adjust to the sensory input, and it causes them great distress. So it's more than just being a little bit sensitive. It's having major distress all day and needing a lot of OT work to help them feel good. I mean, I saw a presentation once where they've done brain studies now and shown that kids with and adults with sensory processing disorder get exposed to a sensory stimulus, and your brain usually like spikes and then goes down and kind of calms down. And the person with sensory processing disorder's brain just keeps spiking until that sensory input is gone. So I think about that a lot when I have kids that don't like wearing certain clothing, that they put on those stiff jeans and their body is getting that annoyance signal over and over and over again. And so that's why it's so important to educate ourselves on the tools we have, the movement tools and the breathing tools we have to help their bodies calm down and regulate. So those are some books. And then I have a website I just checked today, and it's apparently under construction. So don't go to my website, but find me on Instagram at OT Inspired. I love to connect with parents and professionals. And I have a lot of resources available also to help your kids, like step-by-step illustrations on how to work on potty training or how to put on a shirt, all those great things.